I'm Lisa Senecal.
And I am Maya May. We're Speaking starts now. I almost want to do that again. I was like, we need energy. I thought I was like, I want to dance. We need energy, y'all.
We can do that.
I hope everybody's dancing while they're watching this because we need that.
Yeah, we were going to talk about this a little. Welcome, everybody. Hi. We were going to talk about this just a little bit later, but since we need reasons to be really happy and dance a little bit, the Supreme Court's decision that they are not going to. What is that?
That is an alarm. Again, it's like the fire alarm's going off. This is what I was talking about earlier. It was like, this is what we need for democracy
today, everybody. I'm so sorry.
So I'll leave you to talk about democracy while I check and see if my house is on fire.
All right.
Sound like a
all right. Come back soon.
Okay. All right.
Hey, everybody. I'm sure everything's fine. This is not unusual for Maya's building for reasons I don't completely understand. But what we were starting to talk about was that the Supreme Court came down with their decision on whether or not the records were going to be released that Donald Trump's been trying to hide from the 1-6 committee. And they are going to be. And it was an 8-1 decision with only Justice Thomas, thinking that folks shouldn't see that stuff. And I'm sure that has absolutely nothing to do with his wife. Anyway, that is a good thing. 8-1 decision. And hopefully the 1-6 committee is going to see it soon. And we're going to find out. We're going to find out just how deeply involved, or have it prove to everyone else how deeply involved Donald Trump was in every aspect of January 6th and all the planning leading up to it. Tonight, however, we are going to be focusing on Zoomers, Gen Z. They now outnumber all other generations in the US and alive in the US right now, and they are the most diverse generation in US history. They're also on the receiving end of all the messes our generation and the ones before us didn't fix, and all the new ones that we've made, which seems terribly unfair that we have left that all for them. But that's the position they find themselves in. So maybe since they're inheriting all of this, we should start listening to them, because they're not just our next generation of leaders, but they are right now this current massive force for good. And that good includes saving our democracy. They're a really active, engaged generation. And they turned out in 2020 and they helped elect Joe Biden. So we want to make sure they're engaged again for the midterms. And tonight, we're going to be talking with somebody who has been taking a lot of time to talk with and really listen to Gen Z. And that's John Della Volpe. He is the author of Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. We're going to have him coming up very shortly. Really, really excited for that conversation. Hopefully Maya will be back to join us. But before that, once again, we need to take a look at last week in the Republican Party.
This is my 40th Trump rally. 40th! Every rally that Trump has, people wait for days to see Trump.
How many rallies for this, for you is this?
This is my 28th.
Why does Donald Trump have such a strong following? It's almost like a cult following.
We never even heard the term supply chain. If you haven't heard about Trumparilla, you should. No, it's not a thin-cut steak served with a chimichurri sauce. It's a 3-day Trump extravaganza. If you're white, you don't get the vaccine, or if you're white, you don't get therapeutics.
We've got research after research, documented, peer-reviewed, published papers on your end.
Coming up, Satan is making a comeback. Oh, and so is Hillary Clinton.
Joe Biden has been in 1 year the friendliest U.S. president that we've had toward Russia in my lifetime.
Joe Biden is allegedly the president.
In Arizona, in Wisconsin,
in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in the great state of Georgia. Those 4 states, we are going to decertify all those electors.
We had enough evidence to put everybody in prison for life, 300 and some million people.
The ex-girlfriend of Representative Matt Gaetz has testified to a grand jury in a sex trafficking probe of the congressman.
It's not just about critical race theory. I mean, there's a lot of other inappropriate content that can be smuggled in.
On January 7th of last year, the day after, protesters called Nancy Pelosi's office line in the Capitol looking for items they may have left inside the building. Law enforcement took down their numbers and later arrested them.
They want us to leave their bank. What you're going to hear on these recordings are horrific.
We are not closing your account.
Okay.
So we're just asking you to close it.
How do you like that, Brandon? We're the mafia. We're not going to shoot you, but we want to watch you shoot yourself.
Well, that's pleasant.
Yeah, welcome back.
Thank you. Hi. You know, when the alarm's going off, you just act immediately. And that is what I did. I acted. And that's what we are talking about tonight, because Gen Z, the alarm's going off and they're actually answering the call. They're not sitting around infighting and freaking out. They're going, how are we going to save democracy? How are we going to get engaged despite all of the drama and trauma that they have been experiencing?
Yeah, and they really have experienced a lot, not just in the last 2 years. So I am so excited, not only because I have 2 Gen Z kids, but because all the kids that I come in contact with and they're really not kids anymore. I mean, these are, 18 to 29-year-olds. This is a remarkable group of young people, and they give me such hope that we're gonna pull this together. We're gonna take it in the right direction, and it is an inevitability because of who they are.
It is, and I like to, when I watched last week in the Republican Party, I actually like to think about what Gen Z is thinking when they're watching that, because we're supposed to be setting the example, right? The full-grown adults, and instead, what we're seeing is a complete and total disintegration of what it means to act together as a country. And so, we're setting the worst example, and yet they are still coming through. And so I think that speaks so much to their generation and what they're doing. So I'm incredibly excited about talking about more of that tonight.
Yeah, let's get right to that. I want to make sure we have a lot of time to talk. Our guest tonight is John Della Volpe. He is the author of the book that was just released yesterday, Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. God, it's so wonderful to have you with us tonight, John.
I really appreciate you guys having me. Thanks so much. Maya, I am so happy things are okay. As far as we know, right? Things are good?
Yes, everything's okay. That's the thing, though. This alarm, it's been sounding for weeks now, randomly. And I do feel like it is, in America, the alarm is constantly sounding. And some people are just like,
la, la, la. Yeah. Yeah. Whistling will Rome burns.
Yes.
So, John, I want to have us give a little bit of framing for who Gen Z is. Mm-hmm. And you talk about in your book that there are 5 things that have really shaped the Zoomers or Gen Z: that Occupy Wall Street, Trump, Parkland, and the March for Our Lives movement. 17-year-old Darnella Fraser's use of her phone to record the murder of George Floyd, and Greta Thunberg's climate strike. So tell us how you see that shaping this generation.
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me. To take a step back, we're thinking about 70 million young Americans, the most diverse, the most educated in the history of our country. If you package up this generation with the millennials, who are just right ahead of them, who share the same values, you're dealing with a voting bloc that outnumbers baby boomers in the next election and already represents 40% of the votes cast just in the 2020 election. So just 40%. Incredibly significant group of Americans, whether you're running for president of the United States or whether you're running a private corporation, right? We really need to understand their values. And I think, Lisa, it starts with an appreciation that I would argue that no generation in at least 75 years has dealt with more trauma, more chaos in a shorter amount of time than Zoomers. Okay, so think about it. Many of them were born in the mid 1990s, right around the time of 9/11. By the time that they are ready to go to school, we begin red alerts, lockdown drills, school shootings. So this place that's supposed to be safe and secure is anything but that. Enter then also the Great Recession, at a time when millions and millions and millions of young people lost their homes as their parents lost their jobs. We know that 80% of Americans lost 20% of their wealth during that period. The trauma and the chaos and the whiplash between Obama's presidency and Trump's presidency, add in opioids, add in global warming, add in concerns about our democracy, and no generation has had to deal with this. And at the same time, they didn't have anything good happening. That was a communal event about America. I am old enough that I remember Miracle on Ice as a young kid. Right?
You mentioned Lil Nas X, though, in your book. You did say they were united. They have some good things. They're united in fear. And I love that because they do. They do have my daughter's 14, and their values are built around empathy in a way and authenticity in a way that my generation, Gen X, older generations just aren't. And so it's kind of like we're marveling at them. And you say in your book that they say that they're united by fear, that was one of the first answers that someone gave you. But they're united by fear. But what you also seem to speak about is that they're not acting from fear.
No, they are actually more pragmatic in some regards than I might have expected. And I remember 2 weeks after February 14th, 2018, after Parkland, I was on the Harvard campus. It was, and we invited some of the students up. And my first conversation with David Hogg, before the march, he was on his way from Harvard to meet with Speaker Pelosi, or then I think Minority Leader Pelosi. And he told me that this battle was not going to be won, in the next Congress or in the next decade, hopefully over the course of his lifetime, right? He and his friends could create a movement to systemically change the way in which politics works or doesn't work, ultimately making people safer. So like at that very, very early age, in the very early part of this movement, there was this like pragmatism, and they were just kind of so wise, I think, in terms of how they thought about politics and also how they empowered people.
Yeah, that's one of the things that strikes me when I talk to young people that are in that generation, that they are so, including younger than they are. Thinking about conversations I've had with Maya's daughter, they're just sophisticated and mature, so beyond their years, which I'm sure is something that happens when you're dealing with so much coming at you and so much trauma. There is more seriousness that's required of this generation. What do you think, Gen X and boomers, what can we learn from the way we've watched them be so resilient?
And one thing that I'm struck by when I conduct research, whether it's one-on-one interviews, I've been doing a lot, especially with younger people, kind of mini town halls, 25, 30 folks rather than 8 sitting around a table. And I am struck by how comfortable they are using their own voice and identifying kind of injustice, and specifically like even in the lunchroom, right? Even when they see an act of injustice or racism at the lunch table in school, or where they work after school, or clearly kind of in the kind of the broader scheme of our kind of public discourse. I'm just struck by how comfortable they are. Even people who are generally introverted. I've seen this dozens of times. I talk about a young boy named Moses from LA, who shared some experiences and difficult conversations that he had. But I'm struck by that. And I'm also struck with how comfortable they're talking about being uncomfortable, in terms of their concerns about anxiety and stress and mental health. And like, I think this book kind of came together because I had to have this conversation with folks before I could talk about the other issues on my focus group agenda, right? Education, whatever I was talking about, I couldn't get there because so many people wanted to kind of just share their experience living in America today, and how struck they are by the dystopia and the chaos that they were feeling, during the summer of 2017 kind of forward. So I didn't necessarily expect to think about this or even write about this. It just kind of happened, and I couldn't not see it.
Well, and what's really nice about your book is that you talk about hearing them, listening to them, because they have these voices, and the expectation is now that they should be listened to. And so when they're not, there's this kind of, they almost shut down. And so I'm wondering, do you think we're missing a huge opportunity? And when I say we, I mean Democrats right now, meaning the Democratic Party. Are we missing a huge key opportunity to involve them in this fight?
I think so. I mean, every day that we are not actively engaging this generation, we're missing an opportunity that we'll never have again, right? Because it's past. The campaigns obviously help us focus, because there's a timeline, right? We have to focus, optimize every single day. But listen, one of the lessons that I learned as an observer in the first Obama term was young people were critically important to success in Iowa and obviously the general election, but government got in the way, and then they weren't continued to be kind of organized and nurtured, and turnout as well as share for Democrats faltered in 2010, 12, 14, and 16. It's rebounded in 18 because of Trump. It's rebounded again in 20, hit record levels because I think of the work that the Biden campaign, which I was a part of, was able to do. But at this moment, there are tens of millions of young people essentially raising their hands, on social media and other platforms, asking to be engaged. So I think it's just a critical time and a critical opportunity for traditional parties as well as other groups, I always think about three things: identify them, right? Empower them, and then ask them to do something, right? They don't know how to necessarily get engaged, right? But if we ask them to do something, they'll do it. And by the way, I think asking them to bring a couple of friends to vote is going to be what's necessary. We had record-breaking turnout in 2018. Still only 35% showed up, twice as many as we've ever had in the last 36 years. But unless we get that to 70%, 70% of Americans served in World War II, right, to save us from fascism. 70% of young Americans vote in 2022. It's a different country the next day.
I love it. And Lisa and I actually kind of joked about having it was like a high school ditch day. They always have the ditch day. It's like, that should be on voting day. And like, why don't they just all go get in line and vote? And maybe even in the week prior, and it would be great if they could get credit for it even. So it doesn't even have to really be ditch day. I'm not saying you should ditch school. Not saying that. But
you should if it happens to be election day and that's the only time that you can get to the polls. There are worse things than missing a day of school.
Yes.
Like not voting. I was really struck reading the book when you described the massive shift, just reaching out to the Zoomers had in the support that Biden had with young people. And I think candidates and PACs and all these different organizations that are part of this big pro-democracy coalition, I think at times we have a tendency to think either we don't know how to talk to younger people, or there's this assumption that young people don't vote, which just isn't true. So what is your advice for people who are hesitant, either candidates or groups, to reach out and invite these people in to really become engaged and involved?
I think it's one of my favorite questions, and it starts with trust. And like any other relationship, there needs to be some trust, especially with a first-time voter, especially with a young person. They're not going to, support you, vote for you, buy a product from you if they don't like you, right? So you first have to develop that. And I don't know why, but very few candidates, other than Pete Buttigieg, and then obviously Bernie Sanders and a few others, perhaps, young people were not a major focus, surprisingly, of the 2020 Democratic primary. And perhaps some campaigns thought they were too progressive. Others thought that they weren't vote. I don't really understand all of the reasons. But at the end of the day, what we realized was that the values that drive Joe Biden every day in terms of healthcare, providing healthcare and a fair economy and climate, et cetera, and the values of Bernie Sanders weren't dramatically different. Like the tactics and the approaches were, but they could at least have a conversation about shared values, right? And that was critical. I write in the book about, I think it was a week after, maybe 10 days after Super Tuesday, when the campaign was winding down. Bernie Sanders was still part of it. When Joe Biden had like a press availability on TV and on social media, he says, "I hear you." To Bernie Sanders support, "I hear you." And he talked about that. And that was so meaningful to just begin to make that sort of connection. It didn't seal anything. They just began to listen. And over the course of many months, his favorability turned from 33% in the beginning, 55 unfave in May, CNN polling, to 55-32 by October, because he listened. Other members of the progressive movement, had his back, and they kind of worked and collaborated on the platform, et cetera. And that he continued to build that sort of trust. The other part, I think, which is very, very important, is not only building that personal trust and relationship around shared values, but especially for young people, you need to show them that government can do big things, right? And there was, I still think one of the best speeches in the last couple of years was Biden's speech in Philadelphia a week after the Floyd murder, when he talked about it's in the morning. It's when America goes through its darkest times that we have the greatest progress. It was the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment after Civil War, et cetera. So doing two things: developing trust, one, and then showing that government can get big things done. That's some of the communications challenges that we're having today, I suppose, right? In terms of, is government able to work?
Yeah, and what I do like about this generation, and you speak about it in the book, is that while they feel the urgency, they know that it's going to take time. So they're willing to do the work, even if the results won't be seen until later, which I think is great. But when we talk about the "I hear you," because I want to really hammer that home, because it is so important. There's somebody else who's hearing people too. And this is the part that I get nervous about, because the way the far right, Trump, has recruited all of these kind of young, disaffected kids is through saying, "I hear you. You're marginalized. You can't say the things that you wanted to say before. Come on over here." And we had a guest on, Cynthia Miller-Edris, talking about white nationalism and the recruitment in schools and Patriot Front. And we just saw the Turning Point convention. So is that just a minor part of the youth movement? Is that something we should be concerned about?
We have to be concerned about it. We have to be very, very concerned about it. And I have a chapter called Backlash, where I talk about two prolific, members of this alt-right, white supremacy, hate-based kind of community. You just talked about Patriot Front and Thomas Rousseau. He was the Eagle Scout like 4 or 5 years ago. Talked about doing his senior project on Indian lore and wrote about diversity in his high school newspaper. A year later, he was in Charlottesville, kind of involved in that. And then even more, potentially even more scary than that, is young Bruno Kua, who was is like the youngest insurrectionist and one of the most violent insurrectionist, who was driven up from his home in suburban Atlanta. Basically, grew up in a mansion on a farm with a gate. Driven up by both of his parents to run around the Capitol threatening police officers. So, yeah, we have to be very, very concerned about younger people and hate. And I'm especially concerned about it because depression, hopelessness, anxiety, this fear is so alarming that if we're not able to have conversations like this and to normalize just the conversation around politics in schools and in households, et cetera, in a civil way, it drives it underground. right? So younger people are searching on the internet, trying to find answers to legitimate questions, and then they have the potential, especially if they're depressed and anxious, to be recruited, to find community in places that are certainly are not going to be helpful to them and to the country. So it's a big, big concern. A lot of them don't even know they're heading there by the time that they're recruited and mixed up with it. But we see this in the U.S. a lot with young men, and we've seen it in the U.K. actually well before the last couple of years.
Well, you mentioned you see this with young men, and one of the things you talk about in the book is this nexus that's formed between white nationalism and I don't even want to call it misogyny because it's so far beyond misogyny. You described the Patriot Front, discussing how it would be legitimate to have roving bands of white men raping white women, as long as you stay within your same race, then it's okay. If you need to get women back in line, this is a way that you're going to be able to socially shape us to behave. What are they tapping into there on the misogyny side? And it's not unique to this generation either. I don't want to say that it's just young people who
No, it's not. But the scary thing about this is that those folks marched literally in my hometown, okay, in out suburban Boston, Massachusetts, and they are in hundreds of towns across America. And like I said, David Hogg, their goal, okay, they're also pragmatic. Their goal, stated goal, other than, again, raping white women, okay, is for the rest of us to walk into any CVS, across America, see a white boy with khakis and a short haircut and say, is he a member of the Patriot Front? Okay, to normalize that band. And they're clearly kind of talented, and there is an entire industry, around kind of the propaganda and the positioning of it, and the design of the aesthetic, to kind of attract people. And yeah, I mean, one of the outcomes of the Great Recession that we don't talk about is the impact it had on young people, in terms of the upheaval, the economic upheaval, what it did to families. It really impacted the mental health, especially of young boys in broken families with typically with single moms. Okay, so they're just that much more vulnerable, and I think we've got the potential to see that again. And unless we're having these conversations, identify them, that's one of the biggest concerns, one of the most significant concerns I have and I've discovered throughout this book.
Yeah, and as a single mom, I can tell you it's incredibly it's incredibly difficult to be constantly vigilant of what they're doing online. Before the internet, you knew who the kids were hanging out with. Now you really don't know. They go into the room and they're on Discord and they're on Reddit and they're on YouTube, and with the algorithms the way they're set up, they end up down these paths. But there's hope. And that's where we only have a little bit of time left.
And the internet's part of it, shockingly. Like this,
the internet is a good part of hope. The end of your book, the last chapter, there are some pretty bold predictions about the future, looking far into the future. We were talking earlier, I want to throw it on my vision board. What statement actually hit me in particular was technology will outpace the racists when it comes to voting suppression and voting rights. Can you just talk a little bit about not just that prediction, but some of the other predictions at the end of the book that kind of give us that hope?
Yeah, and I think there's a whole, I probably have a bunch of them behind me, right? There are plenty of books written about the future and prediction based upon markets and technology, et cetera, but not enough based upon values, right? So if you think about and channel the kind of the conversation we've had over the last 15 minutes, what do those values mean in 20, 30 years, right? When they're in charge, okay? And I think maybe outside of continuing to technology to outpace, to increase levels of participation in the U.S. so they look like some of the other, top 5 or 10 countries in terms of participation. I think that will happen. Young people voting is a habit, but I think we should think about in three kind of sets, right? One is how we work. Okay, so young people just don't vote every 4 years or every 2 years. They vote in terms of where they want to spend the time, the companies that they want to work with. So unless companies are focused on understanding kind of the social capital, the social good, it's going to be difficult to recruit young people, regardless of their level of education. That's going to be a very, very significant part, I think, of the future in terms of the values impacting capitalism in the private sector. One. Second, I think is how they eat. Right. This is the first Gen Zers or the first plant forward generation. I think there's just tremendous opportunity in this country to see kind of a renaissance of agriculture. You know, in terms of opportunity and work and wellness and a variety of different things I outlined in the book. Second, and then the third, you know, I thought a lot about the American dream through the eyes of young people. And, you know, my generation, Gen X, our generation, I suppose, right? It was really kind of grew up, you know, thinking about going and gecko, right? And how much you can take. This generation is going to view success by the bonds that they make rather than the stuff that they kind of acquire, right? And they will be finding like-minded individuals and choosing to live in those kinds of communities. So it's a pretty optimistic, I think, vision, you know, as long as we can maintain our democracy, okay, for the next couple of years, seriously, and not let the Russos and the Kuas and those folks, you know, kind of take us into a very, very different pathway of which young people are incredibly concerned about those threats, as our Harvard research has shown, you know, for a few years now.
Well, I love that looped all the way back to the beginning of our conversation and why we need to be actively engaging and listening to, really hearing what these kids have to say now, because they are going to be part of saving the democracy over the next year and then 2 years after that. So, John, thank you so much for this book. I encourage everybody. It went on sale yesterday.
Yep.
It is really a phenomenal book, gives some incredible insights into what a great generation these Zoomers are. So thank you for being with us and taking the time and for writing this book.
Yes, it's very nice.
Thanks for elevating the voice of young people, and thanks for all the work that you do. And I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Absolutely. Read the book. And I would love for everybody to connect with the Gen Z folks in their lives. We all have them in our lives, whether those be relatives. You know, it's so important to have these conversations and to say, I hear you, to actually listen. That way they don't fall to the wayside. So they don't get pulled into this kind of disaffected generation, that part of the generation. So like listening, we got to put our listening caps on.
Yeah, really, really listening. They are remarkably insightful and mature, and they might see things differently, but I think it's very easy for people my age to kind of discount, and we're trying to adjust to the fact that our kids no longer just agree with us because they're our kids, and they've grown into these young adults who think very much on their own and have very strong opinions. And as John said, they use their voices. They expect that they're going to be heard, and they're brave about talking. I mean, there are a lot of members of, you know, GOP members of Congress right now who could learn a lot from the courage of Gen Zers.
Yes, absolutely. And that was, we didn't talk about it, and we're running out of time, but the age of Congress is just getting older and older comparatively to back in the day. So also encourage young folks to not just to vote, but to consider running as well, to get into Congress, because we're seeing that on the GOP side. We're seeing it a little bit on the not GOP side, but we need to see it more.
Yeah, we have a better bench on Team Democracy than the Madison Cawthorns and Lauren Boeberts. But they've got to get out there, and they'll have the support. They'll have the support not just of their generation, but they're certainly going to have ours.
Yes.
And their grandparents are listening too. So they can reach the boomers, which is really important. So that was such a great book, and wonderful to have John on. There's hope.
There's hope.
in
There's
our
hope.
future. Yeah,
There's hope.
A lot of hope, a lot of good
Yes.
reason for
And-
hope, and not just kind of hope, airy and fluffy hope, but real fact-based that you can get out of that book.
Mhm.
Yep, that brings us to the end of another show.
Yes.
I wish we could have had more time,
Yeah.
but I always feel that way.
I know. I always feel that way too. There's a lot to talk about these days. So we will be back next week. You can continue the conversation with us online, Twitter. Lisa's at LC Senecal. I'm at Maya on Stage. John is at Della Volpe. And so we'd love to have everybody's feedback as well on the book, what they're the book, the show. We love your comments and questions. It's incredibly helpful to engage and keep the conversation going. And next tomorrow,
Yep.
Rick and Tara are back.
conversations.
Yeah.
Yep. The breakdown with Tara Setmayer and Rick Wilson is tomorrow at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific. Always very interesting conversations happening there. And with everything that's happened today, it's going to be good.
It's going to be a good one.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday.